really wasn't going to have any comment. I support the project. It's just like, different versions of Little Women. When she said that, it shocked me, because you have to have watched Little House on the Prairie to understand what you're talking about.
By now, you've probably heard the rumors. But are they true? Has Melissa Gilbert revealed why she hates the new Little House on the Prairie? Has the original Laura Ingalls turned against the reboot that is rewriting her legacy? Well, this isn't just the story of a television reboot. It's the story of how nostalgia collided with modern culture wars, how a beloved American classic became the center of a political storm before anyone had even watched it, and how one actress found herself trapped inside the controversy. Today, we'll address all the rumors. When headlines travel faster than the truth. Netflix announced its new adaptation in early 2025, describing it not as a remake of Michael Landon's 1974 television series, but as a fresh interpretation of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Almost immediately, the announcement ignited debate before a single episode had aired. Critics questioned whether Netflix would modernize the beloved story to fit contemporary politics. Others welcomed the chance to revisit the American frontier through a more historically informed lens. In a matter of days, the reboot had become another battleground in the broader culture wars, long before audiences knew what it actually looked like. Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls in the original series, didn't agree with everything surrounding Netflix's Little House on the Prairie. She admitted she was too emotionally connected to Michael Landon's original series to judge the reboot immediately. She emphasized that the new production was a different interpretation, not a continuation of the show she grew up making, and she openly disagreed with many of the arguments swirling around the remake. But then, out of nowhere, the political arguments intensified. Before the series premiered, commentator Megyn Kelly publicly warned against what she described as the possibility of Netflix making Little House on the Prairie too woke. The criticism quickly spread online. This had become one of the reboot's defining talking points, and it was months before viewers had seen an episode. The worst kind of publicity a show can get. But did Gilbert actually say she hated the reboot? Before we answer that, let's address the arguments head-on first. Is the criticism of being too woke even warranted? The original was never as untouchable as we remember. The original Little House had already spent decades at the center of heated debates. Many critics, perhaps even all of them, seem to have forgotten that the original was just as controversial in its own time. In fact, some of the loudest complaints directed at Netflix today sound remarkably similar to the criticism Michael Landon faced more than 50 years ago. To understand why the reboot became so divisive, you first have to separate three very different versions of Little House on the Prairie: the real life of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the books she wrote, and the television phenomenon that millions now remember as the definitive story. Laura Ingalls Wilder began publishing the Little House books in 1932, starting with Little House in the Big Woods. Although often described as autobiographical, the books were never intended to be strict historical records. Wilder drew heavily from her childhood experiences growing up across Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota during the late 19th century. But she also reshaped events for younger readers. Entire episodes were condensed, timelines were reorganized, and difficult realities were softened or omitted altogether. Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, played a significant editorial role, helping transform family memories into a cohesive literary series. The result was neither fiction nor pure autobiography, but something in between. That distinction became increasingly important as scholars revisited the books decades later. While generations of readers viewed the series as a celebration of pioneer life, critics pointed to passages describing Native Americans through language and attitudes common in the 19th century, but deeply controversial today. Some historians argued that the books reflected the prejudices of their era, while others maintained they accurately portrayed the perspectives held by settlers without necessarily endorsing them. The debate intensified over the years until, in June of 2018, The American Library Association voted to rename the prestigious Laura Ingalls Wilder Award as the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The organization cited Wilder's depictions of Indigenous people and Black Americans as inconsistent with its values of inclusivity. Supporters of the decision viewed it as an overdue acknowledgement of historical bias, while opponents argued it unfairly judged a writer through a modern lens. Either way, Little House had been provoking difficult conversations long before Netflix ever entered the picture. Then came Michael Landon. When NBC premiered Little House on the Prairie on September 11, 1974, audiences quickly embraced its warmth, humor, and emotional storytelling. Yet anyone expecting a faithful adaptation of Wilder's books soon discovered something very different. Landon used the novels as a foundation rather than a blueprint. Characters appeared years earlier than they had in the books, while others were invented entirely. Storylines that never happened in Wilder's writings became some of the series' most memorable episodes. Historical chronology was frequently ignored whenever it conflicted with a stronger emotional narrative. Even personalities shifted dramatically, with Charles Ingalls emerging as an almost mythic father figure whose wisdom and moral certainty often reflected Landon's own screen persona more than the historical Charles Ingalls. Those creative choices were hardly invisible at the time. Newspaper critics and devoted readers regularly complained that the television series strayed too far from Wilder's work. Purists questioned why beloved book moments disappeared, while fictional disasters, illnesses, and tragedies took their place. Some episodes introduced kidnappings, explosions, killings, bank robberies, and dramatic courtroom battles that bore little resemblance to frontier life as described in the novels. Landon rarely apologized for those departures. His priority was compelling television, not documentary accuracy. He believed audiences connected more deeply with emotional truth than literal historical detail. Ironically, many of the episodes now remembered as classics were completely original creations. Albert Ingalls, one of the franchise's most beloved characters, never existed in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books or in her real family. He was invented specifically for the television series and eventually became central to some of its most emotional storylines, including struggles with addiction and terminal illness. Likewise, the Olesons evolved into exaggerated comic antagonists far beyond their literary counterparts, while Walnut Grove itself became a stage for weekly moral dramas that often reflected contemporary concerns of the 1970s more than the realities of the 1870s. The irony grows even deeper when you examine the subjects Landon chose to explore. Modern audiences often remember the series as wholesome comfort television, yet it repeatedly ventured into territory that surprised even contemporary viewers. Episodes tackled racism, anti-Semitism, alcoholism, disability, child abuse, domestic violence, addiction, grief, sexual assault, and religious intolerance. The Wisdom of Solomon, first broadcast during the third season, confronted racial prejudice through the experiences of Solomon Henry, a black child adopted into a white family. Other episodes addressed blindness, bullying, economic inequality, and corruption. These stories were not universally praised. Some critics questioned whether such serious themes belonged in a family program, while others applauded Landon for refusing to sanitize difficult realities. That history makes today's debates surrounding Netflix especially fascinating. Many viewers criticize the reboot for altering the source material, introducing contemporary perspectives, or emphasizing historical issues they believe were absent from the original. Yet Michael Landon's series did exactly the same thing in its own era, albeit in different ways. He modernized frontier stories for 1970s audiences, inserted contemporary moral questions, and routinely sacrificed historical precision for emotional impact. What seems like sacred tradition today was once viewed by many readers as a radical reinterpretation. Perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding surrounding Little House on the Prairie. For millions of people, Michael Landon's television series has become so deeply embedded in popular culture that it is remembered not as an adaptation, but as the original itself. This makes the criticism against the Netflix remake very unfair. Netflix walks into a minefield. The controversy surrounding Netflix's Little House on the Prairie did not begin with its first episode. It began the moment the project was announced. Long before audiences met the new Laura Ingalls or watched Charles and Caroline arrive on the Kansas prairie, social media had already decided what kind of show it would be. Some celebrated the idea of introducing a new generation to Laura Ingalls Wilder's stories. Others immediately feared the streaming giant would fundamentally change one of television's most beloved family dramas. The irony was impossible to ignore. Netflix wasn't reviving Michael Landon's series at all. It was adapting Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Yet for millions of people, those had become two completely different things. Netflix officially announced the project in early 2025, describing it as a fresh adaptation of Wilder's classic novels rather than a remake of the 1974 NBC series. The distinction sounded simple, but it quickly became the source of enormous confusion. Michael Landon's Little House on the Prairie had remained in syndication for decades, introducing new viewers long after its original run ended in March of 1983. Entire generations had grown up believing Landon's version represented the definitive story. To many fans, changing anything about Little House felt less like adapting literature and more like rewriting a cherished family memory. That emotional attachment meant Netflix inherited not only one of the most recognizable titles in television history, but also decades of nostalgia that no modern production could hope to satisfy completely. Then, the conversation shifted away from production details and toward politics. Concerns intensified when Rebecca Sonnenschein was introduced as the show's creator and executive producer. Sonnenschein was already known for writing on series such as The Vampire Diaries, The Boys, and Archive 8, projects that differed dramatically from wholesome family dramas. Critics questioned whether someone with a background in darker, more mature storytelling could successfully adapt one of America's most treasured literary franchises. Rather than avoiding difficult questions, Sonnenschein explained repeatedly what she hoped to accomplish. She emphasized that the project was based directly on Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, not on Michael Landon's television scripts. That distinction mattered because the books contain details, historical settings, and perspectives that never appeared in the 1970s series. Sonnenschein also said she wanted greater historical authenticity, portraying frontier life with more realism while remaining faithful to Wilder's emotional core. Perhaps most significantly, she spoke about including Native American perspectives and acknowledging that the Ingalls family's settlement in Kansas took place amid disputed treaty lands and the forced displacement of indigenous peoples. Those statements immediately became flashpoints. Supporters viewed that approach as a long-overdue correction. Historians have long pointed out that the original television series devoted relatively little attention to the broader political realities surrounding westward expansion. Laura Ingalls Wilder herself wrote about tensions between settlers and Native Americans, although scholars continue debating how those experiences should be interpreted. Sonnenschein argued that acknowledging this history did not diminish the Ingalls family's story, but enriched it by placing their experiences within a broader historical context. However, some longtime fans worried that emphasizing disputed settlement history would fundamentally alter the hopeful tone they associated with Little House on the Prairie. For these viewers, the series represented family, perseverance, faith, and community rather than national debates over American history. The concern was not simply that new historical perspectives would be added, but that they would overshadow the intimate family story that had attracted audiences for generations. religion became another unexpected battleground. Michael Landon's adaptation frequently portrayed prayer, church gatherings, and Christian values, although it often softened or simplified the religious themes found in Wilder's books. As speculation surrounding Netflix intensified, some commentators claimed the new adaptation would minimize or erase Christianity altogether. Yet Sonnenschein consistently described the Ingalls family's faith as an important part of their identity and indicated it would remain present in the series because it was historically and narratively authentic. Once again, much of the controversy developed around assumptions rather than confirmed production details. So, where does Laura Ingalls from the original stand? Does she hate the remake, as the rumors suggest? Melissa Gilbert gets pulled into a war she never started. For millions of viewers around the world, Melissa Gilbert is and will always be Laura Ingalls. She was only 9 years old when she won the role in Michael Landon's Little House on the Prairie, which premiered on September 11, 1974. And over the next 9 seasons, she grew up in front of an audience of millions. If anyone had earned the right to criticize a new adaptation, it was Gilbert. And she did share her differences with the direction of the remake in some aspects, but she never said or even hinted that she hated the program. Her differences stemmed largely from nostalgia, from refusing to let go of the past. That's not the same as disapproving of the remake. In fact, when Netflix announced in early 2025 that it was developing a new adaptation of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, Gilbert's first reaction surprised many fans. She welcomed the idea of another interpretation. Speaking publicly about the announcement, she explained that there was plenty of room for somebody else's interpretation. She wasn't framing the project as a replacement for Michael Landon's version. She was acknowledging something historians and literary scholars had pointed out for years. Landon's series was already one interpretation of Wilder's books, not the only possible version. At the time, those comments attracted relatively little attention. They lacked the conflict that drives headlines. But only weeks later, the atmosphere surrounding the reboot changed dramatically. Across YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, and X, speculation exploded about what Netflix might do with one of America's most beloved family stories. Would the company modernize the characters? Would religion be minimized? Would historical events be rewritten to fit contemporary politics? Much of the debate unfolded before a trailer, promotional image, or finished script had reached the public. One of the most widely discussed criticisms came from television commentator Megyn Kelly, who publicly questioned whether Netflix would make Little House on the Prairie too woke. Her remarks echoed concerns already circulating among some longtime fans who feared the series would abandon the values they associated with Michael Landon's adaptation. The phrase quickly spread through headlines and opinion pieces, becoming one of the defining narratives surrounding the production. It was precisely the sort of controversy many expected Melissa Gilbert to join. Instead, she responded by turning the conversation in an entirely different direction. Gilbert reminded audiences that the original Little House on the Prairie had never shied away from difficult subjects. Over 9 seasons, Michael Landon's series addressed racism, anti-Semitism, alcoholism, poverty, disability, domestic violence, child abuse, prejudice, and assault. Those episodes were not modern additions imposed by Netflix. They had aired during the 1970s and early 1980s, on network television, often in prime time. Gilbert later pointed to one particular episode that illustrated her argument better than any political debate could. The Wisdom of Solomon, first broadcast during the 3rd season in 1976, follows Solomon Henry, a black boy adopted by Isaiah Edwards and his wife Grace. Rather than presenting Walnut Grove as an idyllic community untouched by prejudice, the episode shows Solomon encountering racism from both children and adults after joining the local school. Gilbert later cited that storyline, while discussing accusations that Netflix was introducing progressive themes into the franchise. Referring to episodes like this, she remarked, "I don't think we get more woke than that." She also visited the Netflix set and met Alice Halsey, the young actress cast as the new Laura Ingalls. Halsey later recalled Gilbert's visit warmly, describing her as generous, supportive, and encouraging. There were no reports of tension, disagreements, or warnings about taking over such an iconic role. For Halsey, meeting the actress who had defined Laura for generations became a memorable vote of confidence. Yet, compared with dramatic online rumors, that story received little attention. The contrast became even more striking after the series premiered in July of 2026. While critics and audiences debated everything from historical accuracy to cinematography, Gilbert remained largely silent. That silence soon became another source of speculation. Some interpreted it as quiet disapproval. Others assumed she was avoiding criticism out of professional courtesy. But when Gilbert finally explained why she had chosen not to comment immediately, her reasoning was remarkably straightforward. She said she was simply too emotionally connected to the original series to judge the new adaptation fairly. After spending nearly a decade portraying Laura Ingalls and forming lifelong relationships with cast members, she believed audiences deserved the opportunity to experience the new series without her opinions shaping the conversation. When Gilbert eventually did speak publicly, many expected the criticism that sensational headlines had been promising for months. Instead, she defended the reboot against some of its harshest attacks. She acknowledged that Netflix's version differed from Michael Landon's series, but she also reminded viewers that Landon's adaptation had differed dramatically from Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Going even further, she observed that Wilder's own novels were not literal historical records, but carefully shaped recollections of frontier life. Many critics spoke as though Michael Landon's series represented the definitive, historically accurate version of Little House on the Prairie. Gilbert knew better than almost anyone. She had lived through 9 seasons of invented characters, altered timelines, fictional tragedies, and dramatic storylines that never appeared in Wilder's books. Rather than denying those creative liberties, she embraced them as part of what made adaptations meaningful. Different storytellers inevitably emphasize different aspects of the same source material. Her advice to viewers reflected that same philosophy. Watch the series if it interests you. Skip it if it doesn't. But don't pretend the original television show never took liberties of its own. It was a measured position, neither an enthusiastic endorsement nor a sweeping condemnation. Yet, nuance rarely dominates the media landscape. Now comes the million-dollar question: is the reboot even actually controversial? By the time Netflix's Little House on the Prairie finally premiered in July of 2026, one thing had become obvious. The show wasn't simply facing a single controversy. It had become the center of several completely different debates unfolding at the same time. Depending on who you asked, the series was either too progressive or not progressive enough, too faithful to history or not faithful enough, too dark or not emotional enough, too similar to Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, or too different from the television classic that millions had grown up with. Somewhere inside that maze of competing opinions, one question kept getting lost. What exactly were people arguing about? Because the closer you examine the backlash, the clearer it becomes that audiences weren't criticizing the same show. They were reacting to entirely different expectations. Some were judging Netflix against Laura Ingalls Wilder's novels. Others were judging it against Michael Landon's 1974 series. Those are two very different standards. The loudest arguments revolved around politics, and remarkably, both sides claimed the reboot had gotten it wrong. Before the series even premiered, critics warned that Netflix would wokeify Laura Ingalls Wilder's frontier stories. Much of that criticism centered on comments by creator Rebecca Sonnenschein, who explained that the new series would adapt Laura Ingalls Wilder's books while giving greater attention to Native American perspectives and the historical realities surrounding the Ingalls family's settlement in Kansas. That immediately sparked accusations from some commentators that Netflix was injecting modern politics into a timeless family story. But the issue wasn't that the series was inventing new history. It was simply choosing to emphasize parts of the existing history that earlier adaptations had largely left in the background. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie is set during the late 1860s, when the Ingalls family settled on land in what is now southeastern Kansas. At the time, that land had been assigned to the Osage Nation under federal treaties, even though many white settlers believed it would soon be opened for permanent homesteading. The uncertainty hangs over the novel itself. Throughout the story, neighbors debate rumors about whether the government will allow them to stay or force them to leave. In the end, that is exactly what happens. The Ingalls family abandons its cabin because settlers are required to leave land they were never legally entitled to occupy. Netflix did not invent that conflict. It comes directly from Wilder's own account. What has changed is the national conversation surrounding those events. During much of the 20th century, frontier stories were often told primarily from the perspective of settlers, celebrating westward expansion as a story of courage, perseverance, and opportunity. Beginning in the later decades of the 20th century and accelerating through scholarship, museums, universities, and public history projects in the 21st century, historians increasingly emphasized that westward expansion also involved broken treaties, forced removals, military conflict, and the displacement of native nations. Rather than replacing one history with another, many scholars argued that both experiences unfolded simultaneously, and that understanding the American frontier requires acknowledging each of them. That shift has not been universally accepted. Some critics argue that newer interpretations overemphasize America's historical failures or judge 19th-century settlers by modern moral standards. Others counter that earlier generations romanticized the frontier by overlooking the experiences of indigenous communities altogether. By giving more screen time to Osage perspectives and the legal uncertainty surrounding settlement, the series was participating in an ongoing historical conversation that has been unfolding in American society for decades. Ironically, the controversy often overlooked the fact that Laura Ingalls Wilder herself never portrayed the family's departure from Kansas as voluntary. Her father built a home, planted crops, and hoped to stay, only to leave when it became clear the settlement could not legally continue. Netflix expanded the historical context surrounding that decision, but the event itself has been part of the Little House story since the book was first published in 1935. When the episodes were finally released, a different criticism emerged. Several reviewers argued that although the series spent more time with Osage characters and gave greater attention to the legal uncertainty surrounding the settlers' presence on treaty land, it still stopped short of fully exploring the violence and long-term consequences of westward expansion. In other words, one audience believed Netflix had gone too far, while another believed it had not gone nearly far enough. Historical accuracy created another fault line, but here the debate became even more fascinating. Rebecca Sonnenschein repeatedly emphasized that she was adapting Laura Ingalls Wilder's books rather than remaking Michael Landon's television series. At first glance, that sounds like a subtle distinction. In reality, it changes almost everything. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie unfolds against a genuine historical dispute that many modern readers never realize is based on real events. When the Ingalls family settled in southeastern Kansas during the late 1860s, they were living on land that had been reserved for the Osage Nation under treaties negotiated with the United States government. Following the Civil War, Thousands of settlers nevertheless moved into the region, convinced that the federal government would eventually open the territory for permanent homesteading. Instead, federal officials ruled that the occupation was unauthorized, and many settlers, including the Ingalls family, were ordered to leave. Wilder incorporates that uncertainty throughout the novel. In fact, the actual history is even more complicated than the novel suggests. The Osage Nation had already endured decades of displacement before the Ingalls family ever arrived. During the early 19th century, the United States negotiated a series of treaties that steadily pushed the Osage westward from their ancestral homelands across present-day Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The treaty, signed in September of 1865, required the Osage to sell large portions of their remaining Kansas lands to help finance their relocation into what is now Oklahoma. But while those negotiations dragged on in Washington, settlers poured into southeastern Kansas faster than the government could enforce its own policies. The result was a chaotic legal limbo in which thousands of homesteaders occupied land that technically remained under Osage title. The Ingalls family found themselves caught in that uncertainty. For much of the 20th century, popular westerns and frontier dramas rarely explored those legal and political complexities in depth. Stories of westward expansion typically celebrated courage, self-reliance, and opportunity, while conflicts with native nations were often simplified or pushed into the background. Michael Landon's Little House on the Prairie largely followed that tradition. Because his series relocated the family to Walnut Grove in Minnesota and focused on weekly stories about neighbors, schools, churches, and family life, the Kansas land dispute that drives Wilder's novel received little attention. That choice reflected the priorities of network television during the 1970s. Today, however, the historical conversation has changed. Over the past several decades, historians, museums, and educators have devoted far greater attention to the experiences of native nations and to the consequences of broken treaties, forced removals, and federal expansion across the American West. That shift has also produced political disagreement. Some Americans argue these subjects deserve greater visibility because they present a more complete picture of the nation's past. Others worry that emphasizing those injustices risks reducing pioneer families to villains. The portrayal of characters also attracted criticism. Michael Landon's Charles Ingalls became one of television's great fathers. Endlessly patient, morally certain, physically capable, and almost heroic in every crisis. Wilder's books present a more complicated picture. Charles is optimistic and loving, but he also struggles financially, makes risky decisions, and repeatedly moves his family in search of better opportunities. The Netflix adaptation leaned more heavily into those hardships. Crop failures carried greater consequences. Debt lingered in the background. Daily survival required exhausting physical labor. Caroline Ingalls was given greater emphasis as an equal partner in keeping the family alive. The series did not invent any of this. This is not some woke reimagining. It was always there in the books, but not on television. Perhaps the most immediately noticeable difference was tone. Michael Landon's Little House on the Prairie became famous for balancing tragedy with hope. Even after heartbreaking episodes involving illness, loss, or disaster, audiences could usually expect reconciliation around the family table, or a quiet conversation that restored optimism before the credits rolled. Netflix deliberately moved in another direction. Cabins felt smaller, winters looked harsher. Mud, hunger, exhaustion, and isolation became recurring visual themes. The frontier no longer appeared as a place where hardship was quickly overcome through determination alone. Instead, survival often seemed uncertain from one day to the next. Such were indeed the unforgiving realities of prairie life. The greatest irony, however, involved faithfulness. Many viewers accused Netflix of betraying the original, but which original were they talking about? Michael Landon's adaptation famously introduced Albert Ingalls, who never existed in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, or in her real family. He created entirely new storylines that had no basis in the novels. Characters aged differently, personalities shifted, timelines were rearranged, and historical events were condensed whenever it served a stronger emotional narrative. Those creative decisions helped transform Little House on the Prairie into one of television's most beloved family dramas. Yet because generations grew up with Landon's version, many came to remember it as the original story itself. During the 1970s, Michael Landon was criticized for changing Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. More than 50 years later, Netflix was criticized for changing Michael Landon's television series. History seems to mirror itself. Our suggestion? Watch before you judge. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.